his wife were doing earlier, that's another really radical change that came about in the Amarna period. In the center of this relief, we see the solar disk representing the autumn, kind of shining its warmth on this nice family scene. We see some more of those stylistic changes that came about in the Amarna period. For instance, Akhenaten's usually known for being shown with his distended stomach, especially in these relief sculptures. And then we see the elongated chin as well. Now we'll take another look at a closer image of Akhenaten, where you can see his elongated chin there, especially. Here now, the depiction of the god of that period, of the Aten, is also unique from previous representations of the sun, or sun gods, solar deities. So typically they were portrayed with a solar disk, but in the Amarna period especially, they're portrayed with rays protruding from the disk that actually have little human hands coming out from the rays. So in this instance, we see a hand reaching out. It holds an ankh, which was a symbol of eternal life in Egypt. Holds an ankh and sort of touches it towards Akhenaten's nose to almost symbolize that it's giving him eternal life in exchange for his devoted service to the Aten. Now, besides those rather stylistic portraits, which even though they did give a little bit more individuality, they still were a little less than realistic of the figures. But however, in the Amarna period, we also see some very almost hyper-realistic portraits that came about. On the left-hand side, we see a bust of Nefertiti, and she is shown, this is a model of her, that's probably just a model that a sculptor used for another bust that he would later on make. And this shows Nefertiti, and even though the neck is a little bit elongated, it looks a lot more lifelike than sculptures that we're used to seeing, so a little bit closer to life. And then next to her we have the head of Queen T, which is another realistic looking sculpture. Queen T was the wife of Akhenaten's father, and so here she's shown with even a little indication of some wrinkle lines possibly. So that's something that would have never been seen before on a ruler, that could have gotten an artist into big trouble for doing something like that. But in the Amarna period, we see examples like these, where it seems as though they desired to give a more lifelike representation of these rulers. Now in the Saite period, the next major period of art we'll discuss, we see a lot of return to Old Kingdom traditions. There's that same sort of frontal, rigid appearance that came about. In the post-Amarna period actually, so what came after the reign of Akhenaten, when Akhenaten passed away, his King Tut took over after him. And unfortunately, a lot of the artwork and monuments from the Amarna period were actually probably destroyed. So the artwork returns to those traditional Old Kingdom elements. Here in the Saite period, we do see a slight change that's really indicative of the Saite period, and that is a slight smile that appears. So just like in the Archaic period of ancient Greece, figures are known for having a little slight smile on them. There's even one figure I recall, I don't have an image of, but it's Medusa with a little slight smile. So even though she's Medusa, she's still smiling. And so in these figures, we know that they're in the Saite period just by that little hint of a smile that we see. Now, in the Saite period, also we see some really notable sarcophagi. For instance, here is this one that shows a good example of what Saite sarcophagi would have looked like. They would have shown the face above where the face of the mummy would have been, and the faces had that slight smile on them again, and were also surrounded by a thick wig. And then there were also carvings on the front of the sarcophagi, or I guess along the top. And these would have told probably some sort of rituals or prayers to help the deceased along their way into the afterlife. Now in the late period, which is the next period of ancient Egypt we'll be looking at, the artwork actually sort of appropriates different traditions from older styles. So for instance, we see that composite view of the Old Kingdom with torso frontal and the arms and legs profile and head as well. But we also see an indication of New Kingdom sculpture. So we see slight more volume in the anatomy of this figure, especially in the arms and legs. And also we see some more softness to the molding of the anatomy that the artist put in here. Also we see that little hint of the Saite smile, so they kind of appropriated from the Saite period as well. So again, in the late period, they tried to combine all of these elements and sort of make their own unique late period art out of older traditions. Now in the Ptolemaic period, we see elements from ancient Greece popping into the Egyptian art. This goes along with the Greeks, which were starting to come into Egypt and become more part of their culture. So in this Brooklyn Blackhead, which is a piece from Egypt from the Ptolemaic period, we see the traditional sort of more frontal, idealized look that was popular in the Old Kingdom and beyond in Egypt. But then we also see the addition of sort of curls, stylistic curly hair, which is something that really came about in Hellenistic Greek art, which was designed to show more movement and emotion, and also some more individuality in the person. So that way we might get an idea of maybe what their hair might have looked like during that period. Now in the Roman period, we see again an appropriation of cultures as well as different traditions. We see some Roman subjects, for instance, on the left-hand side, there's a Roman subject who's clearly wearing Roman garments, and he's also reclining in the same kind of a pose that we might have seen on a Roman sarcophagi statue. However, in the upper left-hand corner, if you look closely, you can see an image of the god Anubis, who is an Egyptian god of mummification and also kind of helped folks along into the afterlife. So it's interesting that even though the Romans were starting to become the major culture in Egypt at that time, they still appropriated Egyptian symbols into their artworks. Now on the right-hand side, there's another new kind of painting that came about in the Roman period, which are these mummy portraits, which would have replaced the traditional death masks, which were popular to place over the heads of mummies in ancient Egypt. So here we see a boy of an Isis cult, and these mummy portraits were unique in that they really showed the individuality of the figures. We can get an idea of maybe sort of popular trends and hairstyles or fashions over the time. So they really give archaeologists a better idea of daily life of individuals that they wouldn't have got from those same idealized portraits of ancient Egypt from in the past. Now just going over, I'm going to go over sort of a brief overview of Egyptian sculpture. Through the time periods, I know that some of the sculpture tends to sort of look similar, but if you look really closely at the unique elements and looking at it all together, kind of helps to see the unique differences that exist in the time periods. So with the pre-dynastic period, we saw with the Palette of King Narmer, the introduction of the composite figure, and also the introduction of registers, so a system of organization. We also saw the introduction of a hierarchy of scale system, where Narmer, or the ruling figure, is the largest figure on the piece, and then other figures are smaller than him as well. Then in the Old Kingdom, we saw the really idealized rulers in sculpture. Their faces are frontal, facing out towards the audience, and they look very stiff and rigid to have a sense of timelessness, so that they could last as long as the Egyptian Hall would last. Then moving on to the Middle Kingdom, they would borrow elements from the Old Kingdom and add a little hint of emotion to those elements. Then in the New Kingdom, we saw block statues became very popular with that really detailed head and then the more block square-like body. Then in the Amarna period, when Akhenaten took over, he really radicalized artwork. And so we see lots of large sculptures of Akhenaten with that same sort of effeminate body that wasn't really designed to look either masculine or feminine, to reflect upon the quality of the Aten that was more of a universal entity rather than gender-based. We also see the more elongated features and distended stomach. And then in relief sculptures of that period, which are called sunken reliefs, because they actually sink into the background of the sculpture. These show images of Akhenaten and his family, more personal scenes of family life. Also in the pre-dynastic period, what I forgot to mention was that this is called a low relief. So low reliefs would have stuck out just a slight bit from the background. The main